All right, everyone get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that people have been arguing about forever, evolution.
Oh yeah, evolution is a big one.
It really is. And for this deep dive, we're going all in on an article from Answers in Genesis. It's fascinating how they unpack this whole debate. What do you think?
I agree, it's super interesting. And like we always do on this show, it's important to understand their perspective, where they're coming from as we explore their argument.
Totally. We always want to make sure we're representing all sides fairly, even when it gets a little, well, controversial. And speaking of different perspectives, this article doesn't waste any time, right?
No, not at all.
They jump right into the thick of it and ask this really important question. Are we all even talking about the same thing when we say evolution? It's like they're saying, hold on a sec, let's define our terms here.
Exactly. It's like that game of telephone where the message gets totally jumbled up as it's passed along.
Yeah.
This article really hits home this difference between macroevolution and microevolution, which is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, so before we go any further, can you break down those terms for us? What's the difference between macro and microevolution?
Sure thing. Think of macroevolution like the epic, sweeping story of evolution, this idea that over like millions of years, all these little gradual changes can transform one type of organism into a completely different one, like a fish eventually turning into a human. It's that classic molecules to man idea.
Okay, got it. The grand scheme of things, the whole shebang. So what's microevolution then?
Microevolution is more about smaller changes happening within a population of a certain organism over time. Like think about all the different dog breeds we have today. They all came from that same ancestor, the wolf, but with variations in size, fur, you name it, all thanks to like selective breeding.
Right, so little changes over shorter times.
Yeah. And the article actually uses the term speciation to describe these sorts of changes. But they're careful to say that just because we can see these variations happening, they don't necessarily mean those massive transformations that macroevolution proposes are possible.
It's like they're saying there's a limit to how much a creature can change.
Right.
Right? Microevolution, or speciation as they call it, is observable, but macroevolution.
Not so much. They draw a hard line there. They say, okay, you can have all these cool variations within a kind, like those finches Darwin studied, each with their beaks perfectly made for what they eat.
Right, right.
But their point is that a finch is always going to be a finch. It's not going to magically transform into a completely different bird, let alone jump categories and become like a lizard or a mammal.
So it's not about denying change over time, but it's more about the extent of that change. It's interesting, though, because you don't often hear that side of things in mainstream conversations about evolution.
I know, right?
But this article doesn't just focus on the modern debate. It takes us back in time to look at the history of these ideas.
Yeah, and that's a really smart move because it helps us see that Darwin didn't just pull the idea of evolution out of thin air. It was a much bigger conversation that had been going on for ages.
It's so easy to get stuck thinking that these big names in science just came up with their ideas all on their own. But really, they were influenced by the ideas and work of the people who came before them, right?
Totally. And Darwin was no different. Like the article talks about those ancient Greek philosophers, they were already wrestling with some of these ideas.
Yeah.
And then there's Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who proposed his own version of evolution before Darwin even published his famous book. It's like Darwin was continuing a conversation that had already started.
It's like he was adding to an ongoing story, not starting a brand new one.
Exactly. And here's a fun fact. Did you know that Darwin's own grandfather was into evolution?
Seriously?
Yeah. His name was Erasmus Darwin, and he even had this evolution-themed motto.
Get out! No way! What was it?
It was E conchis omnia, which means everything from shells in Latin.
Wow. That's pretty cool. It's like evolution ran in the family or something. But wait, the article keeps going, right?
Oh, yeah,
Didn't they find something interesting about where Darwin might have gotten one of his most important ideas?
they did. And it's a pretty wild claim, they say, that Darwin's idea of natural selection might have come from a creationist.
Whoa, wait, really? A creationist? That's pretty ironic considering how often those two sides are, like, total opposites.
I know, right? Makes you think about the whole debate in a different light.
It does. So what's the story there? Was Darwin, like, copying someone else's homework?
Well, they don't go into all the details, but it definitely makes you want to find out more.
Yeah.
This guy, Edward Blythe, he was writing about natural selection way before Darwin.
Interesting. So how does that work? Was Blythe, like, a secret Darwinist hiding in plain sight?
Not really. He actually saw natural selection as something God used to keep his creation in check. kind of like a divine quality control system.
So, survival of the fittest, but within God's design, not as a way for totally new life forms to, like, pop into
You
existence.
got it. That's the key difference. And that's what Darwin kind of flipped on its head.
Yeah. He took this idea of natural selection and stretched it out over millions of years.
Exactly. So instead of just preserving existing species, natural selection became this engine-driving evolution. It's amazing how the same idea can be interpreted in such different ways depending on your beliefs.
It really shows how powerful our perspective is. Speaking of perspective, how does the church fit into all of this?
That's a big part of what the article digs into, how the religious landscape back then, when Darwin was alive, really shaped how people responded to his ideas. It's pretty interesting, actually.
I bet. So set the scene for us. What was going on in the church that might have influenced people's views on evolution?
Well, one of the biggest things was this growing acceptance of geological time periods. Basically, the idea that the Earth wasn't just a few thousand years old, like some people thought the Bible said, but millions, even billions of years old.
So where did this whole idea of a super old Earth come from? Was it Darwin?
Darwin definitely ran with it, especially after reading those geologists, like his buddy Charles Lyell. Lyell was all about those slow, gradual processes shaping the Earth over eons. But those ideas were already floating around before Darwin. What's really interesting is how the church tried to deal with this whole ancient Earth thing while still holding on to their faith.
Right, because how do you square the idea of an Earth that's billions of years old with this idea of a six-day creation?
Exactly. That's where the gap theory comes in. The article talks about it as this attempt to bridge that gap between the Bible and these new scientific discoveries.
Okay, so what's the gap theory? Did they think maybe God took a few billion-year naps between creating each day?
Not exactly. Basically, the gap theory said, what if there was this huge chunk of time between the first and second verses of Genesis? Where it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then the next verse talks about the earth being formless and void.
Right.
So they thought maybe a whole lot happened in between those two verses. Like maybe there's a whole pre-Adamite world, maybe even with its own creatures and stuff, that got destroyed somehow.
So like a whole lost world. That's kind of cool, actually.
Right. And they saw some of those crazy fossils they were digging up back then as leftovers from that time.
It's like something out of Indiana Jones.
Totally. The article even mentions this guy, Thomas Chalmers. He was a big deal in the church back then, a Scottish theologian. He was all about the gap theory.
So it wasn't just some fringe idea then.
No, it was pretty mainstream. And it shows how people were trying to fit these new scientific discoveries with their faith, even if it meant reinterpreting things.
It makes you wonder how people would react to these ideas today. But let's get back to Darwin. How does this all tie back to evolution?
Well, their article argues that because people were starting to accept the idea of an old Earth, it actually made them more open to Darwin's ideas. Like, if you think about it, once you accept that the Earth is billions of years old, this whole idea of species slowly changing over time doesn't seem so far-fetched, right?
It's like it kind of primed people to be more open to it.
Exactly. It's like the ground was ready for Darwin to plant his ideas.
Interesting. So when Darwin's book on the origin of species came out, was it like this huge bomb dropping?
I mean, it definitely caused a stir, but it wasn't like people had never thought about evolution before.
Right. It wasn't a totally new concept.
And like we were saying, the idea of a really old Earth was already out there.
Yeah.
So how did the public react? Was this big showdown between science and religion like in the
Yeah, I
movies?
heard, was it like Frankenstein?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
It definitely got heated, and the article uses the Scopes monkey trial as this perfect example.
Ah, the Scopes monkey trial. I remember learning about that in school. Wasn't that about a teacher who got in trouble for teaching evolution?
That's the one. This science teacher, John Scopes, he basically put himself in the hot seat on purpose to challenge this law in Tennessee. See, back then, they had a law, the Butler Act, that said you couldn't teach evolution in public schools. Can you believe that?
Wow. So you could actually get arrested for teaching a scientific theory.
Yep. And the Scopes trial became this huge media circus, newspapers, radio, the whole nine yards. It was like the O.J. Simpson trial of its day.
So it was about way more than just what was going on in the classroom.
Totally. It became this symbol of the whole fight between science and religion, especially in schools. It was this clash of worldviews playing out on a national stage.
So who are the main players in this whole courtroom drama?
Well, on one side, you had John Scopes, the teacher, who was basically a volunteer for the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. They were determined to fight that law.
Right. They wanted to overturn it.
Yeah. But the real stars of the show were the lawyers. Representing Scopes of the ACLU, you had Clarence Darrow, this legendary defense attorney.
I've heard of him. Wasn't he, like, really charismatic?
Oh yeah, he was a real showman. And on the other side, arguing for the prosecution, William Jennings Bryan.
Wait, wasn't he, like, a politician?
He was a big deal. Former Secretary of State, ran for president a bunch of times, and he was also a devout Christian who was totally against Darwin's ideas.
Wow, talk about a clash of titans. So who won?
Mhm.
Did Darwin's side come out on top?
Well, technically they lost. The jury found Scopes guilty,
Sure.
and he got hit with a small fine, like $100.
Seriously, that's it.
Yeah, it was more symbolic than anything. But here's the thing. The article says that even though the creationists won the trial, the evolutionists might have won something else, public opinion.
How so? I'm confused.
Well, Darrow, the lawyer for Scopes, he was really good at making Bryan, the other lawyer, look like he was stuck in the past and unwilling to even listen to science.
Interesting. So it was almost like a PR battle.
Kind of, yeah.
Eh.
And that ended up shaping how people saw the whole debate from then on.
Wow, so even though creationists won the case, it might have actually helped evolution become more accepted in the long run?
That's what the article argues, yeah. It just goes to show that it's not always about who's right or wrong, but about how people perceive things.
It's all about perception.
Exactly. But let's shift gears a bit. There's one big piece of the puzzle that Darwin didn't even know about back then, genetics.
Oh, right. Darwin didn't know anything about genes and DNA and all that.
Exactly. So that brings us to neo-Darwinism.
Neo-Darwinism. Like Darwinism 2.0.
Yeah, something like that. It's basically taking Darwin's ideas and updating them to include all the stuff we've learned about genetics.
So how does that work? How does neo-Darwinism explain evolution?
Okay, so neo-Darwinism has these four main mechanisms that drive evolution. They're like the four horsemen of evolution.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Who are these evolutionary horsemen?
First up, gene flow. It's basically when genes move between different groups of the same species. So picture this. You've got these birds, right?
Right.
And some of them fly over to a different area and start breeding with the birds there, introducing new genes.
So it's like mixing the gene pool.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's genetic drift. It's basically random changes in how common certain genes are within a population, especially in smaller, isolated groups.
Interesting.
A good example is the bottleneck effect. Imagine a bunch of animals get wiped out by a natural disaster or something, and only a few are left.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's sad, but those survivors, they're the only ones left to pass on their genes. And their genes might be different from the original population just by chance.
So those few survivors end up shaping the future of their species?
Exactly. And then there's natural selection, which is a big part of Darwin's original theory. In neo-Darwinism, it's all about how certain traits that come from genes can give some organisms an advantage.
Survival of the fittest.
Yep. The ones who are better suited to their environment, they're more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on their genes, while the others might not make it.
Right. And then the final horseman,
Mutations.
mutations. Aren't those, like, kind of random?
They are. They're basically these random changes in DNA. Now, most mutations aren't a big deal. They don't really do anything. And some are even harmful.
Right. I've heard that.
But every once in a while, a mutation happens to be beneficial. It actually helps the organism.
Like a superpower.
Kind of. And if that mutation helps it survive and reproduce, then it's more likely to get passed on. And that beneficial trait can spread.
So it's like these four horsemen working together, shaping how life evolves.
Exactly. But one important thing to point out here is that the article doesn't spend a ton of time on the nitty-gritty of these mechanisms.
Right. They're more focused on the bigger picture.
Exactly. They're more interested in what these mechanisms mean for evolution as a whole.
So what's their main issue with neo-Darwinism? If you have gene flow, genetic drift, natural selection, mutations, what's the problem?
Here's the crux of their argument. They say, sure, these things can change existing genetic information, kind of like shuffling a deck of cards.
Okay, I get that.
But none of them actually create new genetic information. And that's what they believe you need for macroevolution to happen.
Okay, so unpack that a bit for me. What do they mean by new genetic information?
It's like this. Think of a book. You can rearrange the words, delete some, add some commas. You could even change the font or put a new cover on it. But no matter what you do to that existing text, you're not going to suddenly create a whole new chapter, let alone a completely different story.
So they're saying all the genetic mixing and matching in the world can't turn a fish into a philosopher. You need, like, brand new information, a whole new chapter in the book of life.
Exactly. And that's where Answers in Genesis takes a very different path from mainstream evolutionary biology. They say that the incredible complexity of even the simplest life forms, all that information packed into them, it points to something more than just random chance over millions of years.
So they're suggesting a designer.
Exactly. And that's where their perspective as Answers in Genesis, an organization rooted in biblical creationism, really comes through. They're setting the stage for their main argument, that the evidence points to a creator. But they don't stop there. They actually get into the scientific evidence for evolution, too.
Oh, so they're not afraid of the nitty-gritty science stuff.
Nope. They tackle those big ones head on. Antibiotic resistance, the origin of life, the fossil record, they go there.
Oh, man, those are some big topics.
They are, and we're going to dive into all of them as we continue exploring how Answers in Genesis approaches the evidence for evolution all through this creationist lens.
Okay, so before the break, we were talking about how this article hints at a designer as an alternative to evolution.
Yeah, they're basically saying the complexity we see in life points to something more than just random chance.
Right, and they're not shy about connecting that designer to God, are they?
Not at all. They're coming right out and saying it's the God of the Bible. And to really get their perspective, we need to understand how they see Genesis, the creation story.
Okay, so they're coming from a young Earth creationist view, right? Where those 6 days of creation were literal days.
Exactly. A literal 6-day creation just a few thousand years ago. And that time frame, they say, really changes how we see death and suffering in the world.
I'm curious about that. How does a young Earth timeline change things?
Well, think about how evolution, especially natural selection, sees death. It's like this essential part of the process, right?
Survival of the fittest.
Yeah. The organisms that aren't as well suited, they die off, and the ones with the good traits, they get to pass those on. So death is what drives change in evolution.
It's like this constant cycle of life and death pushing things forward.
Exactly. But here's where Answers in Genesis goes in a totally different direction. They say that whole idea, death as a creative force, it goes completely against what the Bible says.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, in Genesis, death isn't part of God's original creation. It comes later, after Adam and Eve disobey God, after the fall.
So it's not like death was always part of the plan. It was a consequence of sin.
That's their view. And they say that really changes how we see suffering. Because if death isn't part of some big evolutionary plan, but it's this, disruption of God's perfect design.
It changes everything.
Right. It's a completely different way of looking at the world.
It's like two totally different stories about, what it means to be human.
Exactly. And Answers in Genesis is very clear. They say you can't have it both ways. You can't believe in evolution, where death is this creative force, and still hold on to this biblical understanding of creation and sin.
So they're saying you have to choose.
Pretty much. They even address Christians who try to find a middle ground, those who accept an old earth and evolution but still believe God is the creator.
They're talking about theistic evolution, right?
Yep, but even that isn't enough for them. They say even theistic evolution still has to accept death as this creative force that was around for millions of years before humans.
And that doesn't jive with the God they see in Genesis.
Right, the God who looked at everything he made and said it was good.
It's a tough issue for sure. There are no easy answers. But I do like how this article isn't afraid to tackle these big questions. They obviously feel strongly about this.
Oh yeah, they definitely do. They're passionate about this, and they really want people to understand their viewpoint.
And that's something we always want to do on this show, right? Present different perspectives in a balanced way, even when they're, different from our own.
For sure. It's about presenting the ideas and letting people decide for themselves.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways? What do they want listeners to walk away thinking about?
I think they really want people to see that there are other explanations out there beyond just the mainstream scientific view.
To be open-minded, basically.
Yeah. They want people to think critically, ask tough questions, and come to their own conclusions.
And not just take someone else's word for it.
Exactly. And they point out that this isn't just some abstract idea. This debate about our origins, it affects how we see ourselves, the world, our purpose.
It's about those big questions, right?
Totally. And they leave us with this challenge to examine our own assumptions. Where do our beliefs come from? Who do we trust? Don't be afraid to question what you think you know.
That's good advice for, well, just about anything, isn't it? Not just evolution.
Right.
To always be learning, always be open to new ideas.
Exactly. And they even give some examples of what they call myths about evolution, these common ideas that they think are misleading. Like you always hear that humans and chimps share like 98% of their DNA.
Right, right. Everyone says that.
But they say the statistic is a simplification and it ignores some key differences between us.
So they're saying don't believe everything you hear.
Exactly. And they also question those pictures you see of ape men, those reconstructions showing how we supposedly evolved from apes.
Oh, yeah, those are everywhere.
But they say those images are based more on guesswork than actual fossil evidence, which, according to them, is pretty thin when it comes to these missing links.
So many things to ponder. It really highlights how much of what we believe can be influenced by, well, by how it's presented to us.
It's true.
And that's why we love doing these deep dives.
I know, right?
To dig into these fascinating topics, explore different viewpoints, and hopefully get people thinking.
Absolutely.
So whether you agree with everything in this article or not, hopefully it sparks some curiosity and maybe even some more research on your own.
I think that's the goal, to get people thinking for themselves.
Exactly, because that's what it's all about, right? Learning, growing, and expanding our understanding of the world around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored the fascinating and complex world of evolution as viewed through the lens of answers in Genesis.
This was fun.
Until next time, keep those minds open and never stop exploring.